June 16, 1940. An ordinary Tuesday evening in a darkened government building somewhere in Bordeaux. The walls echo with the sound of hurried footsteps, papers shuffled in desperation. Thunder rumbles in the distance, not weather, but Luftwaffe bombers withdrawing after another day of terror. The city smells of burnt rubber and distant smoke. In a modest office, a man in military uniform sits behind a desk, his face weathered by 70 years of French history. Marshal Philippe Pétain. His hands tremble, not from age, but from a decision that will reverberate through centuries. This is the moment history split into two paths. By mid-June 1940, France lay mortally wounded. Hitler's blitzkrieg had shattered the myth of the Maginot Line. 300,000 German soldiers poured across the Ardennes with mechanical precision, with tanks and aircraft the French generals had dismissed as mere metal toys. The German Army Group B raced toward Paris while Army Group A wheeled south like a scythe cutting wheat. By June 14, German soldiers marched down the Champs-Élysées. Paris, the city of light, had surrendered without a fight to preserve its beauty. The French high command was broken. Morale collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Paul Reynaud, the prime minister who still harbored dreams of continued resistance, found himself isolated in his own government. François Darla, Henri Vigan, and Pierre Laval all whispered the same counsel: the war is lost. The Germans are invincible. We must save what remains. And then there was Marshal Pétain, the Lion of Verdun, the hero of the First World War, a man France had trusted with its very survival in 1916. In 1940, Pétain was 84 years old. He had witnessed 40 years of French military glory and 2 decades of decay. To him, continued resistance meant nothing but more blood, more suffering, more French mothers burying sons in unmarked graves. On June 16, 1940, Pétain received the mandate to form a new government. Charles de Gaulle, then serving as Under-Secretary of State for Defense, was present in that building. He was 50 years old. A career soldier. A man who had spent decades writing books about mobile warfare that the French High Command had ignored. A man who understood, perhaps better than anyone in that room, that defeat was not destiny, it was a failure of imagination. De Gaulle made his choices known: fight on. Evacuate the government to North Africa. Continue the war from the colonies, from the British Isles if necessary. Use the French Navy. Use the Empire. France is larger than its borders. But Pétain, Vigan, and the rest would not hear him. Reynaud resigned. De Gaulle watched the moments slip through his fingers. History records that on June 17, de Gaulle fled to London aboard a British airplane. But what if he had not? What if, on that evening in Bordeaux, as Pétain's agents moved through the corridors consolidating power, de Gaulle had received an urgent summons to a private meeting? What if someone, a friend, a minister, a staff officer, had approached him with a simple warning: the Gestapo is watching you? Pétain does not trust men of principle. You will be arrested by morning if you are still in France. Your only choice is accommodation or exile. And exile means isolation. Powerlessness. What if de Gaulle, exhausted by years of being ignored, having watched his warnings about German tanks fall on deaf ears for a decade, having seen his nation collapse in 6 weeks despite his efforts, had chosen the path of despair instead of defiance? What if he had sat down with Pétain that night and agreed: I will serve your government. I will be the military face of the new France. Together, we will negotiate with Hitler for the best possible terms. I will lend my credibility, my honor, my reputation to this armistice so that Frenchmen will accept it. And perhaps, through pragmatism, through collaboration, through careful management, we might preserve something of France. It was not an impossible choice. Many French military leaders made precisely this choice. Many French politicians did. Many French citizens did, for reasons both noble and base. If de Gaulle had remained in France, he would have become the public face of collaboration. Not to the degree of a Pierre Laval, perhaps de Gaulle's ego would never have permitted such subordination. But present nonetheless. Legitimizing. A barrier between the collaborators and the charges of treason that would haunt Vichy's entire existence. The Vichy regime possessed a fatal weakness: illegitimacy. It was born from defeat, maintained by German bayonets, and always shadowed by the question of whether any Frenchman with honor could truly support such a government. But imagine if Charles de Gaulle, the only French general who had successfully counterattacked against the Germans, the man whose name symbolized resistance and principle, had placed his prestige behind Pétain's government. The French resistance would have been stillborn. The men and women who would spend 5 years in the shadows, blowing up railway lines, encoding messages for London, hiding Jewish children, dying under torture in the basements of Gestapo headquarters, would have found it infinitely harder to justify their actions. De Gaulle was their symbol of legitimacy. He was proof that France had not abandoned itself. The flame of French resistance, which de Gaulle himself said must not and shall not die, would have flickered to near extinction. By 1944, there would have been no 400,000 fighters of the French forces of the interior waiting to rise when the Allies landed. There would have been no sabotaged railway lines, no cut telephone wires, no ambushes of isolated German convoys. The Allies would have faced a German army that could move troops freely across France without fear of partisan attack. The liberation would have cost tens of thousands more Allied lives, American, British, Canadian soldiers who would never see their homes again. And the symbolic cost, on August 26, 1944, when the Allies marched into Paris, there would have been no free French soldiers alongside them. There would have been no moment where a Frenchman, any Frenchman, could claim that his nation had fought for its own freedom. The liberation of France would have been a foreign imposition, not a national resurrection. But what of the German soldiers who occupied that France where de Gaulle had submitted? In the France that actually existed, German soldiers lived in constant danger. Partisan attacks could come at any moment, a sniper's bullet from a rooftop, a grenade tossed into a café, a railway sabotage that sent a train full of supplies into a ravine. SS men learned to travel in groups. Officers varied their routines so assassins could not predict their movements. Entire towns were held collectively responsible for the actions of resistors. Reprisal executions became routine. German soldiers told letters home about the constant fear. About the hatred in the eyes of the French people. About the futility of occupying a land whose people refused to accept occupation. But in the counterfactual France where de Gaulle had capitulated, where the most famous French general had lent his name to collaboration, the German occupation would have been different. Quieter. A Frenchman in Vichy uniform, now with de Gaulle's prestige behind it, could enforce order without German soldiers needing to look over their shoulders constantly. The German soldiers would have experienced what they called a quiet war. Comfortable cafes instead of barricaded strongholds. Wine and cheese instead of alert status. Fraternization instead of suspicion. For ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers, it might have seemed almost pleasant occupying a defeated nation whose military elite had chosen accommodation. But, and this is the crucial point, this comfort would have come at the cost of something these soldiers did not fully understand they were losing. Each moment of normalcy in an occupied France would have been purchased with the dignity of a people. Each glass of wine a collaboration. Each day of peace an acceptance of a new order where France belonged to Germany, where French resources fed German war machines, where French labor worked in German factories. German soldiers expected conquest. What they received in this counterfactual, a France that had given up not just its fight but its very will to resist, would have been something more disturbing. Not the noble victory over a worthy foe, but the suffocation of a nation that chose not to breathe. Symbol is important. History records that during the actual German occupation, bread became the measure of French desperation. Official rations fell to 1,300 calories per day, starvation rations. Butter disappeared. Meat became a dream. French mothers learned to cook with Jerusalem artichokes and Swedish turnips, learned to make soup from vegetable peels that in peace had been discarded. In the actual occupation, this hunger fed resistance. When people are starved, when children cry at night from empty bellies, when old men and women simply surrender to malnutrition and die because their bodies no longer have strength to live, the system that causes this suffering becomes a visible enemy. Every morsel of food withheld becomes a reason to fight. But in the counterfactual France where de Gaulle served Pétain's regime, where French authority appeared to collaborate with German authority, where a respected French general legitimized the arrangement, the hunger would have carried a different meaning. It would have seemed not like the evil of occupation but like the unfortunate necessity of war. Germans must be fed. The army must march. These are the sacrifices demanded of France. The collaborationist government could have managed expectations. Could have explained in newspapers and radio broadcasts, with de Gaulle's voice lending weight to the message that all nations at war suffer. That France is fortunate to have a government protecting its interests. That resistance would only bring harsher treatment. That acceptance is wisdom. Bread becomes a tool of pacification when a respected leader tells people that their hunger is necessary, patriotic, even noble. The same bread that, in actual history, motivated thousands to join the resistance would have become, in this counterfactual, a reason to accept the system. The very hunger that kept France alive as a nation fighting for its freedom would have become a chain binding it to Germany. This is where the true tragedy of the counterfactual lies, not in military logistics or strategic calculations, but in something far more intimate. A man who fought for his country with distinction is a hero. A man who fights for his country against impossible odds, knowing he will lose, and fights anyway, this man becomes something more. He becomes a symbol. A proof that the human spirit can resist the machinery of history itself. But a man who surrenders his principles to convenience, who tells himself that collaboration is pragmatism, who lends the prestige of his honor to the machinery of oppression so that he can sleep in comfort, this man loses something that cannot be regained. French soldiers and resistors did not fight simply to defeat Germany. They fought to preserve something of France that was worth preserving. They fought so that when the war ended, they could look themselves in the mirror. If de Gaulle had remained in Vichy France, if he had rationalized collaboration as necessity, if he had told himself that his prestige could somehow mitigate German demands, he would have spent 5 years watching German officers grow wealthy on French resources, watching French Jews loaded onto trains bound for Auschwitz, watching French culture slowly absorbed into a German-dominated Europe. And he would have told himself, this was the necessary price. This was pragmatism. This was reason. The de Gaulle of actual history never had to make this compromise. And therefore, when liberation came, when he walked down the streets of Paris on August 26, 1944, French people wept not just from joy at being freed from German occupation, but from gratitude to a man who had refused to surrender French honor along with French territory. In the counterfactual, that man would have been walking down different streets. Or perhaps he would not have been walking at all. Pétain was tried as a collaborator after the war. De Gaulle, had he served in that government, would have faced a similar reckoning. The prestige that would have made his collaboration more damaging to the resistance movement would have made his guilt more profound after liberation. History would not have forgiven him the way it forgave some reluctant Vichy officials. He would have been seen as a man who chose the comfortable lie over the dangerous truth. This is the counterfactual's deepest irony. De Gaulle's power lay not in military victories, he was a junior general in a defeated nation. His power lay in his refusal to accept defeat. In one moment of clarity, exhausted and isolated in London, with no army, no government, no resources, speaking into a BBC microphone to an audience that initially did not even hear him properly, Charles de Gaulle gave voice to something that seemed to have died in France, the refusal to bend. Had he remained silent, that silence would have been heard around the world? In every cell where a resistor was tortured. In every synagogue where prayers had to be whispered. In every home where a family gathered around a clandestine radio receiver to hear BBC broadcasts from London. The silence of Charles de Gaulle, the man who could have spoken, but chose not to, would have been the loudest sound in France. The Nazis understood the power of symbols. They had conquered France militarily, but they had not conquered the French spirit. As long as some Frenchmen somewhere refused to accept German hegemony, as long as the idea of French resistance lived, the Nazi system was incomplete. De Gaulle's broadcast was not a military action. It was a spiritual one. It said to France, "You are not conquered. Your nation's defeat is not your destiny. Somewhere, in exile, in the underground, in the hearts of men and women you will never know, France persists." Had he remained silent, that flame would have burned only dimly, kept alive by ordinary people who had no right to be heroes, who risked everything with nothing to gain. But here is what matters most about this counterfactual: it tells us something true about actual history. Somewhere in late June 1940, there was a moment when the future of Western civilization hung in the balance. Not because of military calculations, those all favored Germany, but because of a choice. A single man, exhausted and defeated, had to choose between accepting reality or insisting on an impossible dream. The world he lived in was telling him, surrender is wise. The military situation is hopeless. Your nation is broken. Accept what you cannot change. Build a tolerable life within the constraints you are given. The voice of reasonable men told him, this is pragmatism. But something deeper, something rooted in the belief that human freedom is worth the risk of death, that national honor cannot be traded for safety, that the refusal to bend is sometimes more powerful than the ability to wage war, that deeper voice told him something else. Charles de Gaulle listened to that deeper voice. The counterfactual France where he did not, where he made the reasonable choice, the pragmatic choice, the choice that promised survival, would have been a place where a certain kind of freedom had died. Not dramatically, not in a moment of obvious tragedy, but gradually, through the accumulation of small compromises. It would have been a France where German was learned in schools, where the symbols of German civilization became familiar, accepted, normalized, where the next generation of Frenchmen would grow up without memory of anything different, and therefore without yearning for it. It would have been, in other words, the future the Nazis intended for Europe. Not through immediate conquest, but through the patient transformation of those conquered into willing collaborators in their own subordination. The free France that actually emerged from de Gaulle's June 1940 broadcast was desperately weak, desperately poor, desperately alone. But it was free in a way that mattered. It insisted that France was more than a geographic space. It insisted that the French people had a right to self-determination. It insisted that some things are worth more than survival. It took 5 years and millions of lives to make that insistence real. The path of collaboration would have been smoother, easier, less costly in immediate human suffering. But it would have written the word never over the door of French freedom for generations. This is what did not happen. This is why it matters that Charles de Gaulle, in the darkest hour, refused to surrender the one thing that could not be occupied by any foreign power, the French will to resist. On June 18, 1940, he spoke those words that would echo through history, the flame of French resistance must not and shall not die. He could have let it die. The weight of history pressed him to do so. Reason argued for it. Survival counseled it. Instead, he spoke. And in that moment, in that single choice to refuse the reasonable path, the future remained open. France remained French. The possibility of freedom remained alive, even if faint. That is the true story this counterfactual teaches us, not the alternate history that might have been, but a deeper truth about the actual history that was. The world is not shaped by material forces alone. It is shaped by human choices. And sometimes, the most consequential choices are those made in impossible circumstances by individuals who refuse to accept that what is, must be. Charles de Gaulle made such a choice. This counterfactual reminds us what would have been lost had he not.